Peg Keogh here from College Aid Pro. So, what I want to talk about today is 529s. What's a 529? When is it used? How is it used? So, a 529 is an IRS created savings account. It's a college savings account. So, it's something that people set up. It can be parents, it could be grandparents, it could be anybody that they set up to save for education for a specific beneficiary. So the way the account is set up is you have an owner. So again, that could be a parent, that could be a grandparent, that could be your best friend from college who's very close to your child. It could be anybody can be the owner. And then they designate a beneficiary. And that's the person that will then use these funds down the road to pay for education. So as I'm explaining here, I'm saying that all these people can be the owner of this account. So because they're the owner of the account, that means, as the name says, they own it. So it's not gifting funds to the beneficiary. So that means if I set up an account for one of my kids for college, Peg's the owner, right? If down the road I decide, you know what, I don't want to save, I don't want to use this money for my child, I can take that money, take it out and use it to go to Europe or use it to do whatever I want, right? I'm still the owner of those funds. They are not gifted to the beneficiary. Now, I am going to pay a penalty and I'm going to pay tax on the earnings if I take it out, but I am the owner and I can take that money out of the 529 anytime I want. The other thing I can do as a 529 owner is that I can change the beneficiary. And this is pretty common that parents might do this or grandparents. They might set up a 529, invest some money in it, and put the oldest child as the beneficiary, and they don't need it all. Whatever happens with that child, they can always change the beneficiary on the account. That's not the most common way that people set up 529s. Typically, parents will set up one for each one of their kids with the corresponding beneficiary matching their kids. Neither way is right or wrong. It just really depends on the investor and how they want to set things up. So what are the advantages of setting up a 529? The biggest advantage is that you get tax-free growth. I was about to say tax deferred, and that's not right. I caught myself. It's tax-free growth. So what that means is if you have a 6-year-old and you open up a 529, you start investing in that, you're going to get hopefully gains in there, right? On your investments. Well, you will never pay tax on those gains as long as the funds are used to pay for what's called qualified education expenses. That's an IRS term, and they define what that is. So what it typically is, and this definition has changed through the years, but it's always been tuition and fees, room and board, and books. Anything that's required to go to college. Recently, in the last 5 or so years, they've thrown in a computer because nowadays most kids need a computer to go to college. So if you're buying a computer specifically for college, that's part of the qualified education expenses. Most people, when they save in a 529, they can easily use up the account between tuition and fees, room and board, and books. So it does mean that you need to keep a paper trail, and that's a whole nother conversation of how you need to keep track of everything once your child is in college. But that's the biggest perk of a 529. So if you start one when your child's young, you could double, triple your money potentially, and you're never going to pay tax on those earnings. And then you pull them out for the qualified education expenses while your child's in school, and it's a win-win. You're paying for college, and you're not paying tax on all that. If you decide, hey, I'm not going to set up a 529, but you earmark an investment account that's in stocks and bonds or whatever for college, as there's taxable events in there, if there's stock and you buy and sell it, you have capital gains. If you have mutual funds, you could have mutual fund taxes every year that are created through mutual funds. Capital gains distributions is what they're called. All of that's going to be taxable as you keep investing in that account and you keep managing that account. So that's the biggest perk of a 529, that you get that tax-free earnings throughout the time. The downside is you have to use it on qualified education expenses. Whereas with my example, if you open up an investment account, you can earmark it in your mind for college, but you can really spend that on anything, right? You don't have to spend it on college. But once you put it in that 529, then it falls under that rule. So as I said earlier, if you decide you're not going to change the beneficiary and give it to another up and coming college student, or you need to take it out, or whatever, you have a hardship, you are going to pay tax on the earnings, because remember, that's the big perk. You're also going to pay a 10% penalty. So that's the main downside. So you want to make sure you're not over saving in a 529. Through the years of me doing financial planning and then this specific college financial planning, I've very rarely, there's been a few instances where people have just been power savers and they just have huge balances in 529. So when I say that, I mean well into the hundreds of thousands, 200,000, 300,000. It's pretty rare, because that's pretty difficult to amass that amount of money with everything else you have going on in your life. So don't feel badly if you don't have 529s with those balances. But when you start getting higher and higher balances, you want to be careful, because you don't want to oversave, because then you might have to pull it out for non-higher education expenses, and then you're going to have the penalties and tax on the earnings. So that's how a 529 works. Before we close here, the last thing I want to talk about is, where does this fit in the financial aid world? So 529s, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the owner is the person that owns the account. So that's where it's going to flow as far as financial aid. So if a parent is an owner and a parent is submitting a financial aid form, which is what happens, that's an asset of the parents, not of the student. And the reason is what I explained earlier. It is truly still owned by the owner of that account. In my example, that's the parent. This is very important, because parental assets are looked at a lower percentage than student assets. And it's a very common mistake on financial aid forms, which is understandable, because you're saving for your child. So of course it would seem intuitive that that's an asset of your child, but it isn't. It's actually an asset of yours. It's an asset of the owner, and it is considered a non-retirement asset. So it does have to be disclosed if the person who's submitting the FAFSA is the owner of the account. So again, quick recap, key takeaways here. 529 is a college savings account. You get tax-free growth throughout the life of the account, and when you take out the funds, as long as they're spent on qualified higher education expenses, which is defined by the IRS. And anything that is held in a 529 account is considered an asset of the owner. So if the grandparents are the owners, that's not disclosed on a financial aid form, because the grandparents aren't submitting financial aid forms. So just keep that little caveat in mind. So for a lot of families, this is a great savings tool. It's dependent on your situation. So as everything in this space, the best answer I can give for most questions that I'm asked is it depends. And in this situation, the same as well. So some people, 529s are a great strategy. If you have that extra money to save, you can get that going right away. For other families, maybe not. So it really depends. So if it's something that is kind of resonating with you, go ahead, do some research, look into 529 plans, and as always, happy planning.